Welcome to your channel name, where we bring America's history back to life. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Now, let's begin our story. German captives confront the reality of U.S. industrial power. When the war was raging across Europe, the German soldier was told many things about America. He was told it was a country of big talkers, full of boastful cowboys and lazy factory men. He was told America was soft, spoiled by wealth, unwilling to endure hardship the way Germans could. He was told that America's industry, while large, was clumsy, unorganized, incapable of matching the precision and efficiency of German factories. In the trenches, around the barracks, in the propaganda posters pinned to walls, the message was repeated again and again. Germany had the discipline, the iron, the science, the spirit. America was a giant without muscle, a country of dreamers, who could never keep up with the fatherland's steel. And then came the war. The Wehrmacht advanced with fury, sweeping through nations, swallowing cities, marching beneath banners that declared 1,000 years of glory. For a time, it looked as if the promises had truth behind them. But slowly, like a tide rising in the night, America stirred. Factories that had been making automobiles turned out tanks. Assembly lines that had once pushed refrigerators began to churn out bombers. Shipyards hammered day and night, their fires visible for miles, sparks flying as though the land itself was aflame with iron and steel. America, the soft land across the ocean, awoke with a roar. The German soldiers who fought in Tunisia or in France or in the skies over Europe rarely saw the full force of what America had become. They saw the weapons, yes, the jeeps, the half-tracks, the endless lines of trucks, the bombers flying in waves that blotted out the sun. They heard the rumble of tanks that seemed to roll from nowhere in numbers no one had thought possible. But they did not yet see the heart of it, the place where it all was made. That revelation would come later, when their war ended in capture, and they were shipped across the sea as prisoners of war. The voyage was long and humbling. Crowded into transport ships, guarded by American sailors, the German POWs felt the weight of defeat pressing down on them. Some still clung to pride, muttering that Germany would turn the war around. Others were silent, staring into the endless horizon, wondering what awaited them in the strange new land. Rumors spread among them. They had heard whispers of America's wealth, its vast cities, its machines that never stopped. But there was doubt. It cannot be as they say, many thought. It is propaganda. America is a land of jazz and Hollywood, not of industry and iron. The first sight of the American coast stunned them. New York, with its skyline of steel and glass, loomed like a city from another world. The Statue of Liberty rose from the harbor, and behind her, towers that reached toward the heavens. German soldiers leaned over the rails, silent now, their breath caught. The war had left their homeland scarred with rubble and smoke. Cities that had once been proud were now broken shells, their cathedrals blackened, their factories bombed to twisted ruin. But here was a city untouched, shining, alive, vast beyond measure. Trains screamed across bridges, ships lined the docks in rows that stretched farther than the eye could see. Trucks rolled along roads in endless streams. Even before setting foot on American soil, the prisoners felt something shift inside them. This was not the weak country they had been told of. This was something else entirely. Their journey did not end at the harbor. Loaded into trains, they were carried deep into the American heartland. And it was here, through the windows of those rattling cars, that the true weight of America began to reveal itself. Fields stretched for miles, fertile and green, dotted with farmhouses that seemed to stand with quiet pride. Unlike the Europe they had left behind, scarred by shells and scorched by retreating armies, this land was untouched by war. Crops grew tall, cattle grazed in peace, and the towns they passed bustled with activity. Yet more striking than the land itself were the factories. Mile after mile, city after city, smokestacks rose like forests of iron. Some belched smoke, some whistled with steam, and others glowed in the night like furnaces of the gods. For a German soldier raised to believe that industry was the pride of the fatherland, the sight was humbling. Their factories back home had been built with care, with precision, but they were small compared to this. In America, the scale was staggering. One prisoner, staring at a Ford plant as his train rattled past, whispered to the man beside him, "Do you see? This one factory, it is larger than all of the plants in my city combined." He was not exaggerating. The automobile plants of Detroit had been converted to war production, and they dwarfed anything most Germans had ever imagined. When the prisoners were brought to camps scattered across the country, they were surprised once more. These were not the grim cages of barbed wire they had feared. America had space, and it used it generously. The camps had barracks, kitchens, mess halls, even libraries and recreation fields. There was discipline, yes, and rules were strict, but the prisoners were fed, clothed, and treated with a fairness many had not expected. Yet beyond the fences, life moved with a rhythm that was louder, faster, and more abundant than anything they had known. Some were sent to work in fields, harvesting crops to make up for the shortage of American farmhands who had gone off to war. There, they saw tractors roaring across land so wide it seemed endless. Others were put to work in canneries or lumber yards, places where machines hummed and clanged without pause. Every task, every tool, every process seemed touched by a level of mechanization that left them astonished. And then there were the trains. To a German soldier, railroads were a point of pride. Germany's system was advanced, efficient, a symbol of order. But here in America, the scale was unmatched. Long trains of coal, grain, oil, and steel thundered across the land, pulled by engines that seemed to shake the earth itself. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. It was not just that America had machines. It was that America had so many machines, and they never seemed to stop. Some of the prisoners began to talk among themselves in hushed tones. "Now I understand," one said as he watched a convoy of trucks pass, each carrying more supplies than his unit had seen in months of fighting. "This is why we could not win." Another nodded, his eyes lowered. "They could replace everything. Every tank we destroyed, they built 2 more. Every plane we shot down, 3 took its place. We were never fighting just the soldiers. We were fighting this." And he gestured to the world beyond the fences, the fields, the factories, the roaring trains at night. Lying on their bunks, some thought back to the speeches they had heard, the promises of German superiority, the boasts of iron discipline and efficiency. They remembered the posters that had mocked America as weak, decadent, and disorganized. And now, hearing the distant whistle of a freight train hauling steel to yet another city, they felt the bitter sting of truth. America's strength had not been in loud boasts or empty promises. It had been in the silent, steady turning of wheels, the pounding of hammers, the endless stream of goods that flowed from factory to battlefield. For many, the realization was crushing. It was not only the defeat of their army they were witnessing. It was the shattering of an idea they had been raised to believe, that Germany was the pinnacle of modern power and that no other nation could rival its might. In the heart of America, behind fences of wire but surrounded by abundance, they saw that belief crumble. And in its place grew a grudging, almost painful respect. They would never forget the first time they saw the great American factories lit at night, their windows glowing like the eyes of giants, smoke rising into the stars. They would never forget the endless convoys, the railroads that never slept, the fields that seemed as wide as oceans. For the German prisoners of war, it was not defeat on the battlefield that finally convinced them of America's strength. It was here, in the land itself, in the thundering pulse of its industry. And as they lay in silence, listening to that pulse in the distance, many whispered to themselves words they would never admit aloud. "Now I understand why we lost." The first weeks in the camps passed slowly for many of the captured Germans. At first, they kept to themselves, holding on to discipline and the stiffness that had been drilled into them during the years of war. They lined up with precision for meals, saluted their officers when they crossed paths, and tried to maintain a sense of order in a world that had turned upside down. Yet, outside the fences, America kept moving with a pace that no amount of drilled pride could ignore. At dawn, the sound of trucks often carried across the camp, their engines growling as they moved goods to and from nearby factories. Freight trains rattled by with cars piled high with coal, oil, tanks, and crates of supplies destined for ports. For men who had grown used to shortages, to half-empty supply wagons, to rations stretched thin, the sight of abundance gnawed at them in a way that was hard to put into words. It was not just the material, they were struck by the rhythm, the constant surge of motion. Germany had once prided itself on order and efficiency, but here in America, order meant something else. It was not the rigid discipline of goose-stepping soldiers or finely tuned rail timetables. It was a natural, relentless flow, as if the entire nation were one great machine, and every cog, every wheel, every worker moved with a shared purpose. Some of the prisoners, especially those with mechanical trades, found themselves assigned to labor near American production sites. They never saw the most sensitive facilities. Of course, security was strict and POW labor was carefully monitored. But even at the edges of this vast industrial web, they saw enough to understand the scale. A group of prisoners sent to stack lumber near a sawmill stood in stunned silence as they watched conveyor belts carrying log after log into roaring saws, the blades chewing through trunks as thick as their waists. In Germany, one of them murmured, "This would take a day. Here, it is done in an hour." Others were sent to farms, and there too, the lessons of scale struck them hard. They watched tractors cut through fields wider than many villages. In Europe, machines baled hay, shelled corn, and churned soil with such speed that the human hand seemed almost unnecessary. One farmer, proud of his equipment, showed a group of POWs his new combine harvester. The men watched as it swept through, golden wheat, devouring acres in the time it would have taken them to cut a single row by hand. When the machine turned and came back, one of the prisoners shook his head slowly. "Now I know," he said softly, "why our bread is black and theirs is white." The abundance of food was itself a revelation. Even in captivity, their meals were steady, often hearty compared to what their families were eating back home. Bread, potatoes, beans, sometimes meat, and always enough to fill the stomach. In Germany, rationing had grown severe. Families scraped by on meager portions, eking out thin soups, stretching every scrap. Here in America, food seemed to flow without end. Prisoners in the camps often wrote letters home, carefully censored, of course, where they hinted at this strange reality. Some spoke of their shame in eating better as captives than their children did in the fatherland. But it was not only food and machines that impressed them. It was the people, the guards, the farmers, the factory workers, the women who managed stores and drove trucks. All of them moved with a confidence that was hard to ignore. Many of the POWs had been told that America was a land of chaos, a place where immigrants squabbled, and where people lacked the unity of a true nation. What they saw instead was a land where diversity itself seemed to feed strength. They heard English in many accents, saw men and women of different backgrounds working side by side, and felt the collective energy of a society that seemed bound by purpose even in its differences. One of the most humbling moments for many came when they were allowed, under guard, to help with local harvests. Working alongside American farm boys, they expected disdain or mockery. Instead, many of the young Americans worked with a friendliness that left the Germans unsettled. These were the same men whose country had unleashed wave after wave of bombers over Europe, whose tanks had crushed German defenses, and yet here, in the golden light of a Midwest afternoon, they laughed, traded stories, even shared a jug of cold water. 4 German soldiers raised in the creed of superiority. The experience was disarming. Still, pride dies hard. Some of the officers clung to bitterness, refusing to admit the obvious. They muttered that America's industry was wasteful, that quality mattered more than quantity, that their nation's engineering was unmatched. But even their words rang hollow when confronted with the evidence around them. Day after day, new machines rolled out of factories, new goods shipped to the front. The sheer volume was overwhelming, a tide against which no wall could stand. The psychological weight grew heavier as the months passed. Prisoners received letters from home, letters that spoke of bombed-out cities, of nights spent in air-raid shelters, of shortages that grew more desperate by the day. Wives wrote of children with hollow cheeks, of long lines for bread, of blackouts, and fear. The contrast was unbearable. Here in America, the lights stayed on, trains ran through the night, and stores were stocked with goods. For many Germans, it was the first time they truly felt the war was lost. Not because of the soldiers they had faced in battle, but because of the world they now saw around them. Some nights, conversations in the barracks turned quiet and heavy. Men who had once shouted slogans or cursed the enemy now spoke in low voices of what they had seen. "I thought we were the future," one whispered, staring at the ceiling. "But we were the past. This is the future." Another shook his head, pressing his hands together. "We were told America was weak. But look around you. They could fight for 10 years, 20 years. They could keep building forever." The silence that followed such words was often more powerful than any speech. There were moments, too, of awe that bordered on disbelief. When POWs were transported across the country by train, many pressed their faces to the glass, unable to tear their eyes away from the endless landscapes. They passed through cities alive with neon lights, saw bridges spanning rivers so wide they seemed like seas, and crossed plains where wheat rolled like waves in the wind. They passed shipyards where new vessels rose in rows, each one a floating fortress, hammered together at a pace no German yard could match. They saw factories where aircraft wings stretched across assembly halls larger than any building they had ever entered. And time after time, they shook their heads and muttered the same words. "It is too much. Too much." Some of them began to write journals, quietly noting their observations. Years later, after the war, these journals would be read, and in them the theme was always the same: the shock, the awe, the humbling realization of what America truly was. One prisoner wrote, "When I stood on German soil, I believed we were the strongest. When I stand on American soil, I see that strength is not only in the soldier, but in the land, the machines, the hands that build. Here, strength is endless." Perhaps the most painful realization of all was that America's industry had not been built in wartime alone. Unlike Germany, which had bent its economy under the strain of war until it cracked, America had turned its peacetime abundance into a war machine almost effortlessly. The same factories that made tractors, refrigerators, and cars could turn to tanks and planes without missing a beat. The same farms that fed millions in peace could feed millions in war. The prisoners saw that America had not sacrificed its way of life to fight. It had expanded it. And that truth cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. As months turned to years, and as the war in Europe drew closer to its grim end, the prisoners carried this knowledge within them. They were far from home, far from their broken cities and their starving families. But in the strange quiet of captivity, they had learned a lesson no classroom could teach. They had seen the beating heart of America, and it was louder, stronger, and more unrelenting than anything they had been told. And though they rarely spoke it aloud, each man knew it in his bones. They had not lost simply to armies. They had lost to a nation whose very soil seemed to breathe power, whose people carried an energy that could not be broken, and whose factories were as mighty as fortresses. For the German prisoners staring at the horizon, watching the smoke of American industry curl into the evening sky, the truth was undeniable. This land was not weak. This land was a giant, and it had risen. Spring returned to the camps, and with it came news that shook every prisoner to the core. Germany was collapsing. Cities once thought eternal, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, were in ruins. The Reichstag itself, they heard, had been reduced to a symbol of futility. Letters home grew fewer and more desperate, written in shaky hands that spoke of fear, hunger, and despair. The men gathered in corners of the barracks, heads bent low, whispering about the fate of their loved ones. Every rumor that filtered through the wire seemed darker than the last. And yet, outside the fences, America carried on as though the war were far away. Factories whistled at dawn, trucks thundered on highways, trains screamed across the plains, and fields turned green again under the spring sun. The juxtaposition was unbearable. At home, their families starved in shadows, while here, where they were prisoners, life seemed unstoppable, rich, abundant. The land around them was alive, pulsing with the hum of machines and the promise of tomorrow. Some tried to hold on to anger, insisting America's wealth was unfair, stolen, undeserved. They muttered bitterly that their defeat was only because of material excess, not courage. But even as they spoke, their voices faltered. Deep inside, they knew what they had seen with their own eyes: the factories that never rested, the trains That never ended. The fields that stretched forever was not illusion. It was truth. They had fought against something far greater than soldiers. They had fought against a civilization whose very bones were made of steel and grain, whose breath was smoke from furnaces, whose heart was the pounding of endless engines. The days blurred together, yet certain images branded themselves into memory. A prisoner assigned to help load produce at a market stared in disbelief at baskets overflowing with fruit, apples, oranges, bananas. Bananas. He had not seen one since before the war. In Germany, such luxuries had vanished years ago. Here they were so common that crates of them seemed almost an afterthought. He carried the baskets with shaking hands, wondering how he would ever describe this to his wife, who had written of feeding their children watery cabbage soup. Another group worked near a steel mill, and though they were kept at a distance, the sheer sight of it stunned them. Great cauldrons of molten metal glowed like suns, poured into molds with a force that rattled the ground. The prisoners stood silently, the heat washing over them, their eyes wide as they realized this single mill produced more steel in a day than many German cities could in a week. It was overwhelming, not just in scale but in what it represented. Germany's factories had been bombed to rubble, their furnaces cold, their workers scattered or killed. Here, across the ocean, the furnaces burned hotter than ever, as if the land itself could never be silenced. The prisoners carried these images with them into the barracks at night. They spoke of them in hushed voices, sometimes in awe, sometimes in despair. One man, who had once been a loyal believer in the Reich's destiny, finally broke one evening. Sitting on his bunk, staring at the wooden floor, he said quietly, "They told us America was soft. They told us it was weak. But look around you. Look at what they build, what they grow, what they waste without care. We never had a chance." His words hung heavy in the air, and no one answered. They didn't need to. Every man in that room felt the truth of it. And then came the final blow, word of Germany's surrender. The war was over. Some wept openly, others sat in silence, their heads bowed, their hands gripping the edges of bunks until their knuckles turned white. Pride collapsed within them, not only as soldiers, but as sons of a nation that had promised them glory. They thought of their families, their ruined cities, their lost comrades. And they thought of this place, this strange, abundant land, where trains still whistled through the night and factories still pounded out steel as though the war had never happened. In the months that followed, life in the camps grew quieter. The guards relaxed somewhat, the routine softened, and whispers of eventual repatriation spread among the prisoners. But even as they dreamed of going home, many dreaded the return. What home was left? What waited for them beyond the ruins? Some admitted, in rare moments of honesty, that they feared leaving America, not because they loved captivity, but because here they had glimpsed a land untouched, alive, bursting with life and possibility. To step back into the rubble of Germany after seeing this would be like waking from a dream into a nightmare. And yet they did return. Slowly, over time, ships carried them back across the Atlantic, back to the shattered remnants of their homeland. As they stood on German soil again, they saw with their own eyes what their families' letters had described. Streets reduced to gravel and dust. Factories flattened, their chimneys broken stumps. Train stations silent, their rails twisted by bombs. Children thin and pale, women weary, old men broken. The contrast to what they had left behind in America was almost unbearable. Some tried to describe what they had seen, but words failed. How could they explain the size of American factories, the endless convoys, the trains that never stopped, the abundance of food? How could they make their families believe that such a land existed, that it had crushed them not with cruelty, but with sheer, unstoppable strength? One former prisoner wrote in his diary, "When I left America, I left the future. When I came home, I returned to the past." In the years that followed, those memories lingered. Many of the former POWs carried them quietly, speaking only when asked, often to their children or grandchildren. They spoke of the land across the sea where the lights never went out, where food was plenty, where machines rolled endlessly forward. And always, they spoke with a tone of awe, mixed with sorrow and respect. For they had seen the truth behind the war. They had seen why Germany had fallen and why America had risen. It was not only weapons that had defeated them. It was the hum, of factories in the night, the endless whistle of trains, the rhythm of machines that never paused. It was a strength born not of cruelty, but of abundance. A strength that flowed as naturally as rivers, that grew as steadily as crops, that shone as brightly as the neon lights of American cities untouched by war. In the end, for the German captives, the deepest wound was not the loss of battles or the shame of surrender. It was the shattering of belief. They had been told that Germany was the pinnacle of modern power. They had been told that America was weak, soft, decadent. But behind the fences of their camps, in the roar of industry and the abundance of fields, they learned the truth, and for the rest of their lives, whenever they heard the distant rumble of a train or the pounding of a hammer, they would remember the sound that had haunted their captivity, the sound of a nation whose industrial heart never stopped beating. That it was in that sound, more than on any battlefield, that they finally understood. This was the reality of America's power. This was why they lost. Spring crept back over the camps with a gentleness that felt almost mocking to the men inside the fences. The snow melted from the fields, green returned to the land, and the distant whistle of trains carried across the countryside as though nothing in the world had changed. But inside the barracks, inside the hearts of the captured Germans, everything had changed. The war was no longer a distant thunder. It was a truth they could no longer deny. Germany was collapsing. The letters from home grew scarcer, and when they did arrive, they carried words like stones dropped into the soul. Bombed again. No food. Your son is sick. We hide in cellars at night. They held those papers in their hands with trembling fingers, their eyes wet but unyielding, because men who had fought for years did not cry easily, even when their hearts cracked. And outside those fences, America moved as if untouched by the chaos tearing Europe apart. The prisoners could hear it every morning. The factory whistles, the roar of trucks on the highways, the clanging of hammers, the horns of locomotives hauling their endless burden. Smoke rose in the distance, not from ruin, but from production, from fires that made steel and shaped engines. The contrast was unbearable. Their homeland starved while their enemy thrived. Their children lived in rubble while America's children played in streets where the lights never went dark. The truth became harder and harder to ignore. They had not been fighting soldiers alone. They had been fighting against something far larger, against a whole world of abundance, against a force that seemed as natural and unbreakable as the turning of the earth. Some clung to pride as best they could. They muttered bitterly in the barracks that America's strength was unfair, that it was born only of resources, of excess, of greed. They told themselves that German courage had been greater, that their skill, their engineering, their fighting spirit had been unmatched. But even as they said the words, they felt their hollowness. They remembered the endless convoys of trucks that had rolled through France, the skies filled with bombers that never ceased, the tanks that seemed to appear in wave after wave. They remembered firing the last rounds of ammunition because resupply never came, while their enemy seemed never to run short. And then they looked out through the wire now and saw factories still roaring, trains still moving, fields still full, and they understood. They began to notice details that haunted them. A group assigned to help load produce at a market carried crates heavy with fruit. Apples, pears, even bananas. Bananas, a sight so ordinary to Americans that no one gave it thought. But for these men, it was like seeing gold piled in baskets. They had not seen such fruit in years. Their families at home survived on turnips and black bread, on watery soup. Here, such luxuries were common enough to ship by the crate. So plentiful they were stacked high, without worry of shortage. One prisoner carried a crate of oranges on his shoulder, the bright color burning against his eyes, and he thought of his daughter. Back in Hamburg, her cheeks thin, her belly empty. His throat tightened until he could hardly breathe, and he set the crate down with hands that trembled with both hunger and shame. Another group was marched past a steel mill. They were not allowed near the heart of it, but even from a distance. The sight seared into them. Great vats of molten steel glowed like captured suns, pouring liquid fire into molds that thundered as the ground shook beneath their boots. The prisoners stopped to stare, their mouths dry, their skin hot from the radiating heat. One man whispered, his voice cracked and hoarse, "This one place, it makes more steel in a day than all we could in a week back home." No one corrected him because they all knew it was true. They thought of their own factories, bombed to ruin, their chimneys broken and cold. They thought of workers back home digging through rubble with bare hands, trying to salvage scraps of machinery, while here, across the sea, these furnaces burned day and night as though war were nothing more than an inconvenience, even the smallest. Things cut deep. Spare parts were everywhere. Tools were sharp and plentiful. Machines ran smoothly. Fuel was never scarce. An American farmer filled his truck without counting the gallons, without a glance at ration coupons. A guard pulled a cigarette from a fresh pack as though tobacco would never run dry. At home, their wives tore rags into shoes for children. Their families queued in long lines for scraps. Their cities went dark to hide from the bombers. The contrast was unbearable, and each day behind the fence pressed the truth deeper into their bones. The music haunted them as well. Radios crackled with swing and jazz, with cheerful announcers and songs that carried no weight of despair. The voices sang of hope, of love, of life, of tomorrow. The Germans listened in silence, baffled. How could a nation that sang so lightly fight with such crushing force? But slowly, they began to understand. America could sing because it was never exhausted. It could laugh because it had strength to spare. Its power did not come from grim sacrifice or endless struggle. It came from abundance, from a well so deep that it seemed it could never run dry. And then came the day the news spread like fire across the camp. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. For hours, men sat in stunned silence. Some wept, shoulders shaking in the shadows of their bunks. Others bowed their heads and clenched their fists until their knuckles turned white. Pride shattered in them, not only as soldiers, but as sons of a nation that had promised them victory and delivered them only ruin. They thought of their families in the rubble, of comrades who would never rise again, of children who might never know bread as soft and white as what they ate in captivity. They thought of everything they had believed, that they were the strongest, the most disciplined, the most advanced. And now, sitting behind fences in a foreign land, they saw how false those promises had been. Life in the camps softened after that. The guards were less strict, the days less tense. The prisoners began to dream of going home, though the word home no longer meant what it once did. For what home remained? Their cities were rubble. Their nation was broken. Their families were shadows and letters stained with tears. Some dreaded the return because they had glimpsed something in America that they knew they would never see again in their lifetimes. A land untouched by war, a land of plenty, a land that seemed to breathe. Strength in every acre of soil, every mile of track, every towering factory. To leave that behind for the ruins of Germany felt like walking out of sunlight into a cave. But eventually, they did leave. Ships carried them back across the Atlantic, back to the fatherland. And when they stepped onto German soil once more, the weight of reality crushed them harder than any defeat. Streets they once knew were nothing but rubble. Cathedrals lay blackened and broken. Train stations stood silent, their rails twisted like vines of metal. Factories that had once been the pride of their cities were now heaps of brick and ash. Children stared at them with hollow eyes. Women moved like ghosts. Old men sat on broken steps with empty gazes. The Germany they had left behind had vanished, replaced by a graveyard of smoke and silence. How could they describe what they had seen in America? How could they tell their wives that while they starved, crates of bananas and oranges sat in American markets? How could they tell their children that while German factories lay in ruin, American furnaces poured rivers of steel every day without pause? How could they explain that they had lost not because they lacked courage, but because they had fought against something far larger than courage? Some tried to speak of it, but the words faltered. Their families could not imagine such a land, such abundance, such power, and so many kept it inside. But it lived in them forever. In the quiet of their old age, when their hair had turned white and their children asked what the war had been like, they told the truth that hurt them most. They spoke not only of battles or bombs, but of what they had seen across the ocean. They spoke of a land where trains never stopped, where factories lit the night, where food seemed endless, where machines rolled forward like a tide that could not be held back. And always, their voices carried that same mixture of sorrow and awe, because in the end, the war had not only been lost on the battlefield, It had been lost in the beating heart of America's industry, in the hum of its machines, in the steady rhythm of its people, in the endless bounty of its land. The German captives had seen it with their own eyes. They had heard it in the roar of furnaces, in the thunder of trains, in the laughter of a country that never went hungry. And for the rest of their lives, no matter how far they traveled from those camps, they carried the sound that had haunted their captivity, the sound of a nation whose industrial heart never stopped beating. That was the sound of defeat. That was the sound of America's power. And in that sound, louder than any gunfire, deeper than any explosion, they finally understood the truth. This was why they lost.